In the last video I made about a specific British judge, it was Tan Ikram, I kind of looked at just some of the judgments and comments that he's made during his time as a judge. And it was kind of like a naming and shaming, or sort of highlighting some of the, what I think are potentially bad actors in our justice system. And a lot of people in the comments really seemed to like that. In fact, the video was very successful. So a lot of people in the comments said, we want to see more of this. And also they left comments specifically giving me the names of other people to look at. And one of those names was a man named Judge E.J. Tayler, but his real name is Judge James Tayler. And it's a particularly interesting case that we're going to look at today that was overseen by Judge James Tayler. I'm going to go into all the details, but this case actually runs deeper than some of the Tan Ikram ones because of what it exposes. It exposes, and this is not just me saying this, it exposes that there are far left lobbyists and activists who are training British judges. They are writing guidance, they are training, delivering training sessions to our judges. It's crazy, it's really crazy. But it also shows something else. It shows that no matter how bad of a decision that you make as a judge here in Britain, there are literally zero consequences for your career. So let's get into it. So who is James Tayler, and what exactly is the case that I'm going to be talking about today? Well, James Tayler, at least at the time, was an employment tribunal judge. And what that means is, whenever you have a disagreement with your employer, maybe you've been fired, maybe you think you've been treated unfairly, and you have to take it to court, well, a judge like James Tayler is the kind of judge that you're going to be standing in front of. Now, a woman named Maya Forstater, well, she did lose her job. She was a consultant, and she lost her job because of an opinion that she held. And the opinion is pretty simple. She held, and still does, that there are two sexes, male and female, and that's it. That's her view. Now indulge me for a second and let me just read from the judge's summary so I can prove to you that truly this is quite simply the belief that she held. I'm not oversimplifying it at all. So it says here, the claimant believes that sex is a material reality which should not be conflated with gender or gender identity. Being female is an immutable biological fact, not a feeling or identity. Moreover, sex matters. It is important to be able to talk about and take action against the discrimination, violence and oppression that still affects women and girls because they were born female. That's it. That, to me, that sounds perfectly reasonable. And that is the view that she held, and that's what got her fired. Now, the whole judge's summary is 26 pages long. So, of course, I'm not going to read to you the whole judge's summary. You can go and read it. It's equal parts terrifying and interesting, and I'll leave a link in the description if you're curious enough to go and take a look. But I am going to draw your attention to a few specific points that fall out of this summary. And the first is a really bizarre mention of a Twitter exchange between Maya and a man named Gregor Murray. I say a man named Gregor Murray, but Gregor Murray himself prefers to identify as a transgender, non-binary they-them. Okay, well look, Maya made very clear that she didn't realise at the time that Gregor Murray identified as a transgender, non-binary they-them, and I'll include a picture of Gregor Murray right here so that you can take a look, and perhaps you can bring yourself to forgive Maya for referring to Gregor as a man. Now, Maya, in fact, goes on further to make clear the point that whilst she might sometimes choose to be accommodating and use whatever pronouns someone demands that you use for them, that actually she's really only doing that to be polite, not because she believes it in any way. And she goes on further to state that how can it be possible in law for someone to say, well, I'll be offended if you refer to me by these pronouns based on my biological sex, and because I'm offended, you should lose your job over it. She goes on to liken this point to demanding that a Jewish person eats pork, for example. But I would say it's more similar to demanding, for example, that a Christian refers to the Prophet Muhammad and accepting that he's a prophet. It's just nonsensical, right? How can you say, well, if you as a Christian man do not accept that Muhammad was a prophet, then unfortunately you deserve to lose your job. Okay, so what in all of this then was the judge's conclusion? And I am going to read from the transcript for this because, well, it's completely shocking and insane. I conclude from this and the totality of the evidence that the claimant is an absolutist in her view of sex, and it is a core component of her belief that she will refer to a person by the sex she considered appropriate, even if it violates their dignity and or creates an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. This approach is not worthy of respect in a democratic society. Now that last sentence, I just can't fathom how this judge could write that, look back on it and think, yeah, that makes sense. This approach of holding the idea that mammals have two sexes, male and female, a really well understood biological fact, this approach has no place in a democratic society. Well, unfortunately, Judge James Tayler, yes it does. It's a biologically accepted fact. In fact, in many cases in medical practice and things like that, you have to take into account, by law, the sex of the person that you are treating. So, by law, you have to take into account the sex. And keep in mind, we're not talking about gender here, right? We're not talking about all of that stuff. He makes very clear that she is an absolutist on her position regarding sex. That's it. So how do we arrive at this crazy position where a judge is making judgments like that I think most sane people can recognise are completely unfair and unjust? Well, part of the answer is found within the judge's summary itself. See, there he refers to a document called the Equal Treatment Bench Book, or ETBB. Now, this document is not law. It's provided as guidance to judges, specifically relating to women and transgender issues. Now, what's really fascinating about this document is that in the section on transgender people, it makes a whole bunch of very interesting claims, such as the Equality Act is outdated. So the law, the Equality Act, is outdated. It also goes on to say that referring to someone by their sex may be degrading and harmful to them. Okay, so as I mentioned, the ETBB is not law, it's guidance. But where exactly does this guidance come from? Who writes it? Well, no one knows. Now, it is written under the supervision of a committee of judges, but who writes it? That's the real question. Now, in the English version, we can't really find a clear answer. But in the Scottish version, there is a little footnote that thanks the Equality Network for their input into this document. Now, the Equality Network is a far-left organisation, pro-trans rights, everything, all of that good stuff, and they're being thanked for their input. Now, that could lead you to think that they wrote at least part or all of this document. If true, that means that they are quite literally writing guidance for judges based on far-left political opinions. That is crazy. That's truly crazy, and it explains a lot of what's happening within our judicial system. But there are actually some far worse cases that we can look at where far-left activists and lobbyists are training judges. Now, in a Guardian article, the former CEO of Stonewall, Ruth Hunt, admitted that they are delivering training to judges, and she made very clear in that article that that includes training on trans rights issues. Fascinating. But it gets worse, because you see, in an internal publication for judges, presumably like a journal that one judge writes and the rest of them go and read it, well, they were discussing the ETBB, and they were also discussing a great training session that they'd had from a group called Gendered Intelligence, a pro-trans rights lobbying group. Now, what's really fascinating about this, not just that the judges are receiving training from this group, Gendered Intelligence, but Gendered Intelligence themselves have some pretty serious controversial legal cases that are going through the courts at the moment. So you have Gendered Intelligence training judges, giving advice, guidance, lobbying judges, and then also going through the courts in some particularly sort of controversial cases. How is that fair? How does that make any sense? That they are training judges in their way of thinking, and then also going to the court to be sat in front of those judges to argue their case, which of course is going to align with their thinking. It's just so wrong. It's just so horribly morally wrong. And I think everyone can obviously see that. So what was the fallout from this whole case? Well, Judge Taylor's ruling was overturned at appeal. And you might be tempted to think, well, that's justice working as it's intended. There was an appeal. The original judgment was found to be wrong and overturned. Yeah, but think how expensive that is in terms of going to court not only once, but then a second time for an appeal, just so that you can have some very obvious moral facts and principles upheld. A lot of people simply couldn't afford to do that. And look, if you're still tempted to think, well, at least, now that's in law, that's been restored and judges can look at that case law and make decisions in the future. Okay, but everything else I spoke about is still happening. The far left lobbyists and activists are still out there training judges, infiltrating our justice system. And I think that this explains a lot of the terrible things that are going on in our justice system that we see constantly. Now, you're probably also wondering, well, what happened to James Tayler? Did he get a slap on the wrist? Did he get told off? No, of course not. He got promoted. He's now an even more senior judge, exerting his bizarre influence on even more senior cases. And that's the point I was getting at in the intro. It's almost like it doesn't matter if you get things wrong as a judge in this country, because there are really no consequences. We saw that in the case of Ikram, who was presiding over the case of pro-Hamas supporters, and yet he himself had been liking anti-Israel posts on LinkedIn. And what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. You know, it's really broken. It's a really, really horrible system. I think the problem is, the kind of person who is going to want to rule against a judge is also a judge, and they can kind of look after themselves in a way. Now look, I don't really want to get sued, so do I have any proof that that's the case? No, it's pure speculation, and it may be completely false. You can make your own mind up. That's just something that I might be thinking about. Now, I just want to say, you know, all credit for this story really goes to Maya Forstater. Of course, it's her story, but also she did a lot of the digging around all of these issues, probably because it affects her primarily so much. You can find her on X. Go and give her a like or a follow if you're interested in these kinds of issues, or alternatively, or as well, give me a subscribe if you're not already subscribed. That'd be really helpful. You know, the growth of this channel has been amazing, and I'm really, really grateful. Also, leave a comment, like, all that good stuff, and I'll try and get back to you. Thank you very much. Thank you for all of your support, and I hope you have a great new year.